give you a little bit of background on what's going on right now, where we're at in history. The Crusades are going wide open right now. The battles that they were having with the Muslims in the Middle East was keeping the pontiff in the Roman Church quite busy trying to fight back that, because they were losing all the major churches. They'll lose where the Coptic Church had taken over. They lost it to the Muslims, and they were able to stay around. The Coptics were for up till now. They're still in business, but at any rate, in Egypt, the Muslims had taken over. In Jerusalem, they completely destroyed the Jerusalem church till there wasn't any. The Muslims did. There wasn't any remnant of them. The church at Antioch in Pisidia, same thing. The church in Constantinople, the same thing. They completely destroyed it. And as far as the building in Constantinople, it still stands, but it is now a mosque. But that's what's going on at this particular time, and that's keeping the Pope in Rome quite busy, so he doesn't have the manpower or the money, because it was bankrupting all the kingdoms in Europe at this time. They were having a hard time. The Roman Church had gotten a hold of 1/3 of all the land in Europe by that time. And they were ruthless as far as their renting those properties out and collecting taxes on those properties. And the monarchs were beginning to get tired of them getting all the money when they were supporting what was going on in the Middle East, trying to stop the Muslims from coming in. The Roman trying to think what his name, what they call the head of the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, what we're talking about now is the Holy Roman Empire, not the Roman Empire that we saw way back in the time of Christ. It had dwindled down now that they just had a small sliver into northern and central Italy, and then all of France, Spain, and Germany, and England was what the Holy Roman Empire was made up. And all those kings had to pay homage to the emperor. And the emperor wasn't getting the revenue that he wanted, because he was helping with the pontiff in Rome, because he was subject to him too. That's when the rule was completely sewed up that everybody had to answer, all the leaders of these countries had to answer to the pontiff in Rome. And what he said went, and he started, we talked about this the money that they were collecting to keep to get rid of their sins, and talking about the time that things were going on, that people were beginning to question the total authority of the Roman pontiff and what he was doing. And right here at the end, where Wycliffe came in on the scene, he was part of this trying to get away from the monastic orders. And those monastic orders were the different groups where had the monasteries set up, where people just withdrew, or the priesthood just withdrew into a monastic order to be able to do their studying. And of course, the printing press hadn't been invented. We're going to get to that today, because we're getting close to the time that the printing press. So these monastic orders were the ones that were doing the writing of the books and things, and copying stuff. And that's all they did. They were totally isolated from the rest of the world. Yes, Ed.
Do you think, maybe this is a rhetorical question, but God's hand is at work behind the scenes? He knows, he knew, and he had foretold that the church would fall away.
Yes.
And they did. And you've been taking us on that journey. But where's God actually in all of this?
He was right. He's in the forefront. This was what he ordained was going to happen. Paul talked about it. Peter talked about it, and they spelled it out. When you look in 2 Thessalonians, where it talks about the man of God sitting in his in the temple of God, professing to be God, and all these things fit right along on that Roman pontiff, and they were refusing to let anybody. Nobody was allowed to read the Bible. And the best part of the way they kept them from doing it is they did not equip those priests and teaching them Latin, because the Latin Vulgate of the Bible was the only Bible that was available during that period of time. So if you couldn't read Latin, you're just out of luck. And also before Constantinople fell, which is now Istanbul, Turkey, is where this is at. And that's where all the Greek manuscripts were at. Now, as the Muslims advanced on the eastern side of the empire, those people that had their hands on these Greek texts started getting them out into the European hands, and that's when we're going to see where they're going to beginning to start making copies of it in the Greek language, when that's when they're going to find out how badly the Vulgate was translated, and when they finally get back to reading the Greek. So what's ended up happening here now is at the end of Wycliffe's conclusions was that he plainly states right there that the Pope was the Antichrist. He did not miss that one. He was one of the first ones that started really expounding on the fact that this man in Rome is not a Christian. He's a non-believer, and he's worse than a heretic, and his bishops are in the same boat. The bishops, most of the bishops, didn't even know Latin, so they couldn't read it. And it wasn't until people like him, Wycliffe, that came along and got interested, because he was a priest. He taught himself Latin so he could translate the New Testament, and they were dead set against that. They didn't even want the Vulgate translated into the English language or any other language, because they did not feel that these people had the Holy Spirit within them. That's what they said, because they were they thought the bishops and the Pope thought and still think to this day that they're in the seat of the apostles. And that's where they're at. That's the reason why they say they can do the traditions overtake the Holy Scriptures. And that's what they teach today. They're still teaching that fact. Last time I talked about that Wycliffe was the John the Baptist. No, I missed that one. He was the morning. They call him the morning star of the Reformation movement, because he was the bright star that shines early in the morning when the new era was coming on, where we were changing from a feudal system into a Reformation system where that mankind found themselves of value. Before that, they had them such under their thumb that if you was a blacksmith or your dad was a blacksmith, that's what you're going to be. You had no choice. If he was a farmer, he was going to be a farmer. And that's how you could not become king. You could not become a general in the army. You were what you were under the feudal system. And they're putting this to an end. That's what's happening right now. So to be able to be buried, I brought up last time, was in a sanctified grave, which is called the Catholic cemeteries now. You have to be in good standing with the church. Well, 31 years after Wycliffe died, when the same group that the Council of Constance condemned him as a heretic, and we'll find that he was not the only one that was condemned as a heretic during that council. So was two other people that we're going to talk about tonight, and that was John Huss and Jerome is the two. So to be buried in this Catholic cemetery, you had to be sanctified to do that. Well, they had buried Wycliffe in a Catholic cemetery, so 31 years after his death, they dug him up and put him in another grave. And when they got around to having the burnings and things, they dug that grave up and burned his bones and throwed them into the Savon River in England, because they didn't want anybody worshiping at his grave. So they did a real good number on him. All right, the next one coming up right now is John Hess. John Hess was from Prague, and he was a priest. He was a brilliant man. He had probably one of the highest IQs of anybody that was in the. I don't know. Have any of y'all ever heard of John Hess? Anybody? Okay, I hadn't even heard of him until we started. I started this study. Well, anyway, he's the one that is considered the John the Baptist of the Reformation movement, because he set things up for Martin Luther. Because he was about 100 years before Martin Luther. Back in, he was born in 1373. In 1382, the King Edward died, which was in England, and they made his son, his grandson, Richard II, which we know him as the from Robin Hood and the king that was doing the fighting for the in the Middle East and the work that they were doing, and Robin Hood was back in the country trying to keep the thing. You know, he was fictitious, but I mean that's the story that was being told. But anyway, he was Richard, when he took the throne, he was only 15 years old, and so they went out and found a princess from Bohemia by the name of Anna, and she became his wife. And he loved her dearly, and she died fairly young. But one of the big things that they did was they started the universities started exchanging students. The student exchange program in Bohemia, which is in the Czechoslovakia, and they were bringing the students there, and we're coming into contact with John Wycliffe. Now, Richard did not like John Wycliffe, but Anna did. And she was the one that was protecting him from being killed. And they brought him up on charges of heresy, and he got sick and died. And then they buried him, and that was the end of that until the Pope says, "Hey, we got a heretic buried on sanctified ground. We're going to take him back. We're going to take him and get him out of there." But that was what was happening with her. But when she died, he lost his ability to be protected by her. But the damage to what was going on had already occurred, because John Wycliffe's notes and sermons and papers started being circulated in Czechoslovakia. And a young student by the name of Jerome carried those documents to Czechoslovakia. And there was also a young minister there. That John Hess was, and they became fast and close friends, and they started sharing their information. And actually, Jerome was the one that kind of converted John Hess into reading the Bible, because they were able to get it in the Latin Bible, and it was all translated into English. And since they were doing English stuff in Czechoslovakia, Hess was able to get his hands on the Bible, and that's when he realized that this was not the first century church that they belonged to, and that's what they were. That's what he came back and started saying, "Hey, we need to get back to some of the things that we have said in our brotherhood in the last number of years. We need to be doing Bible things in Bible ways, and we need to be calling Bible, using Bible names for Bible titles." I cannot find. He could not find anywhere in there the fact that there's such a thing as purgatory, and there's such thing as indulgences. And so he started, he was such beloved by the people of Prague that he was the minister for the Roman Church in Prague, Czechoslovakia. And it became the largest congregation in the country. They had over 3,000 members that belonged to the Roman Church in Czechoslovakia. Now, one of the things that congregation had started doing was that they had, before John Hess got there, was that they had changed from the Latin services and had gone to start doing the services in the Czech language. Yes, Ed.
Maybe a point of interest, at least to me, because I've been there, but there's a New Testament congregation. There's the Lord's people in Prague, Czechoslovakia. There is a vibrant congregation there now.
Well, the things that they was espousing was right along with Wycliffe and right along with the New Testament. And so that's why he started strongly opposing the Roman Church. How he got his hands on that was because one of the things that he was doing to finish his schooling up was that he was working out of the library, translating and writing, because we still don't have the printing press here. He was having to write and making copies of everything that Wycliffe had done, and the Vulgate Bible being printed in Latin and in English. So they had two forms of it there, and so he was the one that was doing that, and especially those sermon notes of Wycliffe were being distributed all over the country. So that was the big thing that was starting to do. He said, one of the things that he said was that just like there's non-believers in the church, which there are people here that go in the Lord's church that are non-believers. They're here because for other reasons than in God. There's non-believers in the leadership, and especially the Pope of Rome himself was a non-believer in Jesus Christ because he was teaching false doctrine. And that's one of the things that he locked in on right quick, was the fact that all the leadership of the Roman Church and all the Pope himself were non-believers. Now see, Wycliffe had come up to the same conclusion, and now he's come up with his conclusion. He said that not only was the Pope a reprobate, but also his cardinals were reprobates right in behind him. So he was very blunt and very outspoken in what was going on. Well, there was so much going on within that at that time that the Pope had his attention on what was going on in the eastern part of the provinces. So, and plus, like I said, they were all about bankrupt, and that's when this indulgence thing kept coming up, and they started fighting the indulgence of it too, because they realized the people were beginning to realize how much property that the Roman Church owned in these kingdoms, and they could not get their revenues that they needed, and there was all their revenues were being expended by the Holy Roman Empire to help come up with these soldiers to be able to go to the east and fight in the Crusades. He was when we talk about John Hess was preaching in the vernacular of the people, because the Roman Church as a whole taught in Latin, and they taught in Latin up until this century. They just started changing that mode of thing at one of the last councils that they had in the 1970s, when Pope John Paul changed the Mass and allowed them to start teaching their Mass, doing their Mass in the languages of the people. For doing this, the Pope finally got around to excommunicating John Hess. And that really upset the people in Czechoslovakia. So he had to, he summoned Hess to Rome, but Rome the people in Czechoslovakia would not let Hess leave because they cared too much for him, because they knew what would happen if he went there. Well, he got a permission from the Holy Roman Emperor that he would have safe passage to and from this inquest when he went up there to do his to defend himself, because he really wanted to go. He really thought that he could. He was like Paul was when he was in Jerusalem, thought that he could walk out in the crowd because he was a Jew and he had been one of them, and all. He thought the same way, that he could go out there and teach these people, and they would start reforming. He was not trying to start another church. He was just trying to reform the Roman church to make it more like what the scriptures were saying and stop teaching these things. And so when he was summons to the council and Constance, it was right at the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. It was not in Rome that he went to. He was there when he got there. He was treated real nice at first, and then within a few weeks they arrested him and threw him in jail. And he stayed in that jail until they decided to burn him at the stake. And one of the things that they did to him was that they made this hat out of paper that was it was called a mitre, that came up into a point at the top of his head, and they printed demons all the way around it, and he had put on the arched head, the arch heretic. And what does that remind you of? That you've seen this before. You ever heard of a dunce cap that they had in school years and years ago? That's where that came from. Was the fact that they were taking heretics and putting these caps on them, parading them through the city to their death. And when he seen when Hess seen the hat, he says, "I can't think of anything more fitting for me to stand and being falsely accused of being a heretic when I am a follower of Jesus Christ." And as they lit the fire, they had him up a little bit higher, and he was chained there, so the ropes wouldn't burn loose. And as soon as they lit the fire, he started singing, and he sung until the fire silenced his voice. And he was singing religious songs while he was dying. Well, then, within the next year, Jerome, his friend, he had slipped out of the Holy Roman Empire, and he had gained enough strength that he thought he could come back in, and he went back to Czechoslovakia, which is Bohemia at that time, and he started preaching the same things that John Hess was preaching. And when the heat started rising on him, as far as them trying to capture him, he tried to sneak back out, and he almost made it to the border when they caught him. And when they did that, they did the same thing to him that they did to John Hess. They took and put the same hat on him, or not the same, another hat just like it, because they burnt that first one up. But they took that dunce cap and then put on him, marched him through the streets, burned him at the stake, and he sang religious songs as he was burning also.
Byrl, you were talking earlier about, you had alluded to 2 Thessalonians, about this activity, and Paul writes about the lawless one, 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 8, about the lawless one, and then in verse 9, coming in accordance with the activity of Satan with all power of signs and false wonders, and with all the deception of wickedness for those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth so as to be saved. For this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence that they might believe what is false, in order they may all be judged who did not believe the truth but took pleasure in wickedness.
And if that doesn't speak of what's going on in the Roman Church at that time, I don't know how much plainer it could be. And it was passages like that was the reasons that they hid the Bible from these people, because they didn't want them to know this. One of the things too that Hess did, just before, as he was there on the stake, was that he says His last name, Hess, means goose. He says, within 100 years, you're frying this goose, but there's going to be a swan that's going to come along that you're not going to be able to burn him at the stake. And that swan that came along was Martin Luther. So within that, right at that 100-year time period, so he had sort of a pathetic utterance there that he predicted that the next one, he says, I'm just the beginning. Because what we're doing is we're telling the truth, and the truth is what's going to set us free. Another thing that brain just dumped on me. He was excommunicated 4 different times. And I figured one excommunication should be enough for him, but they didn't like that, so John Hess was excommunicated 4 different times.
Does that potentially mean that, I guess it's like get 4 life sentences for...
Well, being excommunicated means that you could not preach in any of their congregations. You could not be buried on consecrated grounds. You could not be taken in by anybody. They had to shun you. They had to, if you were hungry, you just starved to death because they wasn't going to feed you.
Yeah. Once is generally enough.
One would do that.
Yeah, one would do that.
Yeah.
Did they say 4 times?
No, 4 different times. It was 4 different times over this period of time that they had excommunicated. He was first excommunicated by the first time by the bishop in that area. Then the other 2 times he was excommunicated by the Pope himself, and the last time by the group of people that had the council there excommunicating him for the 4th time. After 30 years, when they killed him, that tore Czechoslovakia wide open. They revolted completely. So they pulled a lot of the Crusaders off of the front lines and brought them back to fight these Christians. And they also brought back the Holy Roman Emperor, brought his army up. And they fought for 30 years, and each time they come into battle with the people in Bohemia, the Bohemians won. And at the end of 30 years, the coffers were so empty that the Pope was forced to recognize the beliefs of the Bohemian Church. And so that was I told you about the 7 Catholic churches, and Bohemian was one of them. That's that group, and they still are there today.
If I'm incorrect, let me know, but did they come eventually from Prague, from Czechoslovakia, we were talking about the Bohemians, they became the Moravians.
Moravians, that's them.
And so there's a Moravian church today.
Yes.
That are descendants
of that. Yes, the Moravians. And they also call them the Bohemian Church, but it's the Moravians. You're right. So that's what happened to them. Now, they were also called I think I went the wrong way. Yeah, where the Bohemian Brothers are the Moravian Church. Okay, and our time is up, isn't it? Well, I'm going slower than what I thought it was going to be going, but at least we're getting there. But you begin to see what's happening. It's beginning to come out. There's things going on around. They've got, not only have they got the what's happening in the Middle East to them with the fighting in the Crusades, but they also had another outbreak of the bubonic plague. So a lot of people are dying from the bubonic plague, and when the next person up is going to be Luther himself. And what John Hess told everybody, he said, "I am a Wycliffeite. I follow what John Wycliffe is teaching, and so you can call me a Wycliffeite." When Martin Luther comes in, he's going to say, "Well, I'm a Hessite, so that makes me a Wycliffeite also." To form religious organization, they were saying that to say, this is where I'm at. If you want to know where I came from, this is where all this is coming from. They're setting the foundation up right there for all of the Protestant movement is being set up from what Wycliffe had done, what Hess has done, and then of course the others that are coming up in the next few people that'll be coming on the scene. All of them are setting all of this up to be able to totally make that break from the Roman Church.